It was July 5th, 1852. Hundreds of people were waiting outside Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York, waiting to get in to see a famed orator. He had been asked to speak about the 4th of July that day. As he approached the stage wearing a waistcoat, a bow tie, and a jacket, he steps up to the podium and he says, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You must rejoice. I must mourn." Now fast forward to 2013, July 4, 2013, I am standing right here on this stage, and Paula Koppel is seated in the audience with Richard McDeasy. I have been asked to talk about the 4th of July. And I ask this simple question. Outside our political freedoms, what does the 4th of July say to our souls, our collective souls, the soul of the nation, to us individually? And I borrowed from this man, Jacob Needleman, who wrote an extraordinary book called The American Soul, and he said America has a deep mystical core. Yes, the forefathers were rationalists, they were thinkers, they loved science, but these men were deists, and they were Freemasons, and they were Quakers and Rosicrucians, Unitarians. These people could not be fit into a slot. They were not conservative religionists. They were not men or women of orthodox beliefs. They were explorers of the mind. They were explorers of the soul. And one of the great freedoms they bestowed upon us in that July 4th time frame was not just political freedoms, it was the freedom to doubt. It was the freedom to change our minds. It was the freedom to evolve. This is the DNA of the great documents that forged this nation, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. This is the DNA of our nation. And I would submit it's the DNA of the New Thought movement of which Unity is part of. So how was it 7 years ago, when I was speaking about the soul of the nation and the positivities and the light, I didn't raise the two greatest original sins in the soul of America? The virtual eradication of the American Indian, the first people of this country, and the equally heinous enslavement of the African American. Why wasn't I willing to delve into the shadow of the soul of America 7 years ago? Now, I think of all people on the planet, I think Carl Jung talks about the shadow best. In fact, Carl Jung was the man who came up with the notion of shadow. He was a protege of Sigmund Freud, and unlike Freud, he took his psychology into a much more definitive spiritual direction. He talked about archetypes. He talked about a collective unconscious. And he said the shadow is the part of ourselves that we deny. It's the part of ourselves, and it could be a light or a dark shadow. It could be something that is good within us, that an attribute that we don't acknowledge. More often, it's the denied self, the guilt and the shame, those things we project onto others. And Jung said that only when you engage the dark shadow within you do you proceed on the spiritual path. So how is it that I was talking about the 4th of July that day 7 years ago, and I did not mention the speech at Corinthian Hall, July 5th, 1852, because on that day, a voice rang out to the nation. An uncomfortable tone was spoken. That if you were a person of color, your experience of the 4th of July was much different than the rest of the nation. Now, of course, many of you know that voice was that of Frederick Douglass, statesman, orator, novelist, and also a gentleman that worked with Abraham Lincoln several times in his life. But most importantly, at least initially, is Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave. He is an escaped slave from Maryland. Now I personally have heard some very good things about Frederick Douglass. And one of those good things is this speech he gave 10 years prior to the Civil War. The title of his talk was, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And today I'm going to use 2 or 3 passages from his talk as part of the framework of what I'll be speaking about. And here's how he started the talk that day. "Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give frame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, but I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good that they did and the principles that they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. Now, think about what Douglass is talking about here. He's not saying us and them so much. He's saying fellow Americans, fellow citizens, despite the fact that we here in this nation had experienced, the African American experienced 200 years of shackles to that point. And yet Douglass is referring to us as fellow citizens. And it's brilliant what he does, because he talks about the founders' ideals. They were flawed men, but they had these exceptional ideals. So how could those ideals exist in the same land as institutional slavery? So in a way, he was pointing out the hypocrisy. And you have to think about what was going on at the time that Douglass gave this speech. It wasn't just the 200 years of slavery that he was referring to. The Fugitive Slave Act had just been passed in the United States a year or two before his talk. And what did that Slave Act say? In essence, as a white citizen, if an escaped slave was found in the North, West, South, or East, you were duty-bound to return that slave to the authorities so that, quote-unquote, property could be returned to its rightful owner. Now, this enraged many people across the United States, and none more than the great people of Boston and Massachusetts. Now, forgive me, it seems like every time I stand on this stage at Unity, I bring up the Transcendentalists. Because I can't speak about America without speaking about them. They are the conscience of America. And the preeminent Transcendentalist, Ralph Waldo Emerson, once hearing about the Fugitive Slave Act, called upon the American people to engage in civil disobedience. He said, "I will not obey it, by God." Mitch Horowitz, I think, says it best, that these Transcendentalists were highly metaphysical. And if you really want to know what the founders were thinking 100 years beforehand, go to the Transcendentalists. These Transcendentalists were not only on a deep inner spiritual journey, they were activists. They were the movers and shakers of their age. They took their spirituality out into the world so that they were at the very forefront of educational reform. They were proselytizers of the rights of women, the infirmed, the uneducated, prisoners. They were at the very forefront of the environmental movement, and yes, they were abolitionists at the very forefront of abolishing slavery. Now, Douglass might have known that things were going to get worse before they get better, because you're still 9 years out before the Civil War. And in the United States, we had something called the Missouri Compromise, which said simply, once we move out westward, we're not going to allow slavery above a certain latitude in the nation. Well, Congress throws that out. Within a few years of Douglass's speech, the most ignominious decision ever rendered by a Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an escaped slave. He petitions the court for his freedom. I'm an American citizen. Give me my freedom. And what does the court say to him? No. You're not an American citizen. You have no rights. You are chattel and property. And perhaps the most indignant act that took place was actually on the floor of Congress. A white senator known as Charles Sumner got up and said that slavery is an abominable institution. And for that, Southern senators, one in particular, caned him on the floor of the Senate. You think we're polarized today? Man took out a gold leaf cane, beat him to unconsciousness, bloodied. Charles Sumner almost passed away. Now, Emerson, in his response to this event, said it represented the nation's divide. I do not see how a barbarous community and a civilized community can constitute one state. I think we must get rid of slavery, or we must get rid of freedom. Now, returning to Douglass's talk on that July 5th, he says, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you, this day, rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought you light and healing has brought stripes and death to me. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustices and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Now, I should say that it wasn't just the transcendentalists who came out against slavery, abolitionists. A shout out to our evangelical brothers and sisters. Early on, evangelicals came out radically against slavery. William Lloyd Garrison was an evangelical Christian preacher. He started the Liberator in 1830, many years before the Civil War. It was funded by 2 evangelicals. And he said when he put out the paper, I will not be silenced by God. He said, America stands on a great precipice, ready to plunge into darkness, declaring slavery the bellwether of America's fidelity to its covenant with God. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, is that Garrison, again, a dyed-in-the-wool Christian, seeing some of his brethren, especially in the South, moving away from the abolitionist movement. In fact, those preachers started using the Bible as justification for slavery. So later in his life, Garrison said, you know, those people I used to refer to as irreligious, like the Quakers and the Transcendentalists and the Freethinkers, I'm more on their side of the ledger. Now, of course, when we talk about the 4th of July, everyone knows the story of Independence Day, how the founders met in Independence Hall in Philadelphia on that hot summer's day in 1776. And again, they swore to each other their life, their liberty, their sacred honor, that they would move forth and create a nation unlike the world had ever seen, where all men are created equal. So we know that story. How many of us really know the story of July 4th and how it applies to the Civil War and to slavery? Sometimes a metaphor or a symbol speaks more loudly than an event itself. July 4th, 1863, right smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. The 2 greatest battles that take place on the same day, virtually. The weekend of July 4th in the north, Gettysburg is being fought. In the south, it's Vicksburg. On July 3rd, Robert E. Lee sends Pickett for Pickett's charge. It fails. And the next day, Robert E. Lee must vacate the field of Gettysburg and return to the South a defeated general. On the very same day, Ulysses S. Grant forces the Confederates to surrender in Vicksburg. That splits the Confederacy in 2. The Mississippi River is opened up, and for all intents and purposes, the game is over. The Confederacy is going to lose this war. Now, of course, the war raged for another 2 more years. Hundreds of thousands more men would die on the battlefield, more men that have died in all of our wars combined. Now, think for a moment what kinds this must have left behind. And in the South, July 4th was not celebrated for many generations. As a matter of fact, Vicksburg, which surrendered on July 4th, did not celebrate the 4th of July for 81 years. 81 years. It's towards the end of World War II. And we think for a moment that these wounds don't run deep within the American soul. Now, right after the Civil War, there were 10 to 12 years, I would say not halcyon days, but hopeful days. Because what happened? After Lincoln died, more or less, Grant becomes president. He makes sure that there are Union troops down south, and black people get the right to vote. They also get 40 acres and a mule. So, 7 African-American men, not women, we'll deal with that at another time, folks. They didn't get the vote for another 50 years. But 7 African-American men go to Congress. 6 go to the House of Representatives. 1 goes to the Senate. There's this glimmer of hope, but after Grant is no longer president and the North is tired of sending their troops down south because they had eradicated the Ku Klux Klan, or at least they thought they had, 100 years of Jim Crow now begins. And now a new hell is unleashed on African Americans in the South. 100 years of rape, torture, lynching, and murder. And the homegrown American terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan, reconfigures the Civil War. It was never about slavery, they said. No. It's all about states' rights. It's The Lost Cause. (1939). Billie Holiday. 1939, this is now, 80 years after the war? Sings a song called Strange Fruit. And here is the words of the first verse. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Do you know when the last lynching took place in this area? You can guess inside your heads. 1950. 1950. I bet you there are people watching today that were alive at the time of the last lynching in southeastern Virginia. Now, let me state this as plainly as I can. White guilt is not the answer here. As A Course in Miracles says, and a great repository of wisdom, anything that deals with shame or guilt separates us from our Father, Mother, God, separates us from our soul. This is not about judging ourselves. This is not about shame or guilt. This is not about judgment. It's about awakening. It's about a spiritual awakening. It really is about cleansing the American soul. Now, I know some folks watching today say, Chris, why are you bringing all of this up? Slavery's done with. Jim Crow is done with. You are unearthing wounds and showing wounds that don't need to be addressed any longer. Things have changed. Well, in fact, Supreme Court Justice John Roberts says we live in a post-racial age. Well, there's a line attributed to Mark Twain. I don't think Mark ever said this, but it goes something like this. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So let's think of history in this regard. Think of history as a series of circles, a helix, if you will. And we are on that point, on the circle, in the same place as we were at the time of the Civil War, but maybe several steps up the helix. So you have 250 years of slavery, you have 100 years of Jim Crow. Now, in the light of the Voting Rights Act and Martin Luther King, we're only, quote unquote, living with some systemic racism. There is some of that residue that has been left behind. This is part of evolution. And we hope that each time up the helix, each time there is an evolutionary change for the positive. But to say that we have cleansed the American soul at this point would be misleading. James Baldwin was an amazing man. He was a writer, he was a novelist, he was a poet, he was an activist. I call him the 20th century Frederick Douglass because he spoke out on rights and most people really did not know how to hear what he was saying. He appeared on the Dick Cavett Show in 1968, and Dick Cavett, as earnestly as he possibly could, was trying to understand Mr. Baldwin and said, haven't things gotten better? Haven't things improved? There's a black middle class, there are some black business folks, they're in sports now, heck, they're even in commercials, is what he said. And James Baldwin very eloquently steps back and answers him. Now we're going to play a 1-minute clip. There is a word, an offensive word that's used in this segment, but I think given the context and who states it, it's absolutely appropriate.
If we were white, if we were Jewish, if we were Poles, if we had, in fact, in your mind, a frame of reference, our heroes would be your heroes too. Nat Turner would be a hero for you instead of a threat. Malcolm X might still be alive. It is that you can face, in some ways, the discontent of white people. When they rise, they are heroes. And everyone is very proud of brave little Israel, a state against which I have nothing. I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not an anti-Semite. But when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, give me liberty or give me death, the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him.
Baldwin would see three of his greatest heroes assassinated in the 1960s, all of them before the age of 40. Baldwin said this: societies never know it, but the war of the artist with his society is a lover's war. And he does at his best what lovers do, which is to reveal the beloved to himself. And with that revelation, make freedom real. Make freedom real. Finally, concluding with the end portion of Frederick Douglass's speech. Allow me to say, notwithstanding the dark picture I have presented this day, I do not despair of this country. The arm of the Lord is not shortened. The doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world. Established customs of hurtful character can no longer fence themselves in. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are heard on the other. The far-off and fabulous Pacific rolls in grandeur at our feet. The celestial empire, the mystery of ages, is being solved. The fiat of the Almighty, let there be light, has not yet spent its force. No abuse, no outrage can now hide itself from the all-pervading light. Frederick Douglass, July 5th, 1852. One step up the helix each time. With each revolution, we hope and pray and see that it gets better. Martin Luther King, of course, said many great things in his life. Perhaps he is best known, or his most famous quote might be, and I've truncated it here a bit, "The arc of the universe bends towards justice." Here he is at the mall, the I Have a Dream speech. The dream is that systemic racism that we see in our police systems, in our legal system, in our prison systems, will someday be eradicated, and they will become less and less faint reminders of the dark shadow of the American soul. Eckhart Tolle, who I find to be a very inspirational teacher, says the universe wants to become more conscious, and the main life purpose for all human beings is to come into alignment with that universal purpose. In other words, spiritual growth is becoming conscious of our unconscious. We are shedding light onto our shadow, and we're integrating that into our soul. Maya Angelou said it perhaps more directly: do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. These times are not for the faint of heart. Polarization in our nation is stark. Everyone feels it. Personal relationships, mostly wherever we go. Thomas Paine said at the time of the Revolution, the times have found us, so you, your soul contract, my soul contract, has agreed to be on this planet, in this earth, in this nation, at this time. And all of us are going to be we're going to be asked to stand up and be counted, to open our hearts wide, to let our voices be heard, to do it with power and to do it with love. Jean de Keon, who came here, I think on 2 occasions, to talk about the Gnostic Gospels and the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, Mary Magdalene, said that times like this calls for courage, courage, which is French for rage of the heart. And even Jesus knew when it was time to throw the money changers out of the temple. A recent American presidential candidate said, the world needs America now more than ever, but only if America can be at her best. July 4th, it really is about the integration of the American soul, isn't it? Let us be comforted. His truth is marching on. Let's go into meditation. If you would just take a moment to take a deep breath. And as we are here today, we are reminded of our unity. We're individual egos in a world. Yes, we know that. We all have our own individual personalities, our own individual missions. But somewhere, somehow, we are so deeply connected that we are one. With our family, with our friends, with our so-called enemies, we are one. And America will get through this as well. It has before. It has moved ever more closely to the light. Things may look dark at times, but the ideals are in place. So just feel that oneness for a moment. Relax into it. Know that we are all connected. That no matter what our politics may be, we start with this. We love our country. We love our ideals. We want the best for our country and all the people that live in it. And we are called and we are summoned to move that light forward. Let's take a moment in silence here. Take that in. For this inspiration and for this light, we are truly grateful. And so it is. Amen.